Thank you. Lavanya has given an excellent summary and analysis of what is in the Paris Treaty, so my job as respondent is merely to actually add to some of the points she made and also hopefully end us on, for lunch on a bit more of an optimistic note. The points that I'd like to briefly discuss are how the architecture of the Paris Accord intersects with international and national politics, and then the role of the 1.5 degree goal in that. And then finally, what will determine whether the treaty is effective or not. My first point is that we have to remember that the phrases global governance and international law are oxymorons. Global governance and laws are not like national governments and laws. This reminds me of a famous story about Joseph Stalin. Stalin was told that the Pope had said that he should stop oppressing Catholics in Russia, and Stalin's reply was, "The Pope? How many army divisions does he have?" And we could equally ask Ban Ki-moon and the UNFCCC, how many divisions do they have? In nations, governance arrangements and laws are enforced through hard power, but in international situations, we don't have such sources of hard power. So when Canada, for example, violated its supposedly legal obligations under the Kyoto Protocol, not much happened. But despite this lack of hard power, we have lots of examples of international arrangements harnessing soft power very successfully, from trade agreements to law of the sea, cooperation in aviation, the internet, and so on. So the key question is how will the Paris Accord effectively harness soft power in international relations? And a good starting point is to actually ask why the Kyoto architecture was so ineffective. The ideal of Kyoto was to have a set of legally binding top-down targets and then allocate those targets in an equitable way based on historical responsibility and capacity to mitigate, and then finally provide some sanctions for those who don't deliver. But this created three big political problems. Despite the fact it was a noble vision, the politics really didn't work. First, it created a zero-sum political dynamic where any country taking on more share of targets meant another country had less share, and this provided a big negative incentive. Second, it created interminable and ultimately unsolvable debates about what were fair basis for equity, and a confrontational dynamic between developed and developing countries. And third, the legal structure, and this was quite critical, subsumed national law on core economic interests to international law, and this was a major loss of sovereignty and became a very big no-go point for both China and the US in the negotiations that followed. Now, out of the ashes of Copenhagen, where this architecture collapsed because of these three reasons, this new architecture that became Paris emerged, and it was historically referred to as a bottom-up pledge and review system, and historically has also been viewed by the NGO community as much weaker and as a compromise. And I even remember in Copenhagen an NGO leader giving a passionate and angry plea that we should not go to this kind of architecture. But its theoretical weaknesses are outweighed by its political strengths. A head of state once told me that there are two sources of soft power in international relations. One is the power of embarrassment, and the other is the power of mutual sanction. First, no president or prime minister wants to be embarrassed on the international stage because it diminishes their domestic political power. People want their country and their leaders to be seen as respected and powerful on the international stage, and anything that threatens that is a threat to their domestic political power. Second, there are very few cases where the world imposes true top-down sanctions on bad behavior. Trade may be the kind of one major exception. But rather, countries are very skilled at mutually enforcing cooperation through diplomatic deals, horse trading, pressure across multiple areas of cooperation. So, for example, if you don't play ball with me in the UNFCCC, I won't support something you want in the G20 or the WTO or someplace else. And it's messy, it's not pretty, but it can actually work. So the beauty of Paris is that it harnesses these two forces, the power of embarrassment and the power of mutual accountability. So even though it's a legally weaker agreement than many would have liked, it may be a more politically sustainable and powerful agreement. So then the question is, and I'll start wrapping up, is how do we make this architecture effective, and what's the role of the 1.5 degree goal? I'd highlight 3 points. First is a big focus on strengthening the domestic political commitments. this is the foundation of the Paris Agreement. And there's an old saying that all politics is local, but also all international politics is ultimately national. And we have to remember that NDC stands for nationally determined commitments. As Lavanya noted, only the process and conduct is under international law. All the commitments that really matter are under domestic law. So making climate solutions, investment in clean energy, et cetera, domestic political winners is ultimately going to determine whether this agreement succeeds. Second is make the Paris reporting and transparency mechanisms as strong as possible to activate that fear of embarrassment and mutual accountability mechanisms that I talked about, and Lavanya gave some specifics. And then third is also more of a political point, strengthening and creating more high ambition coalitions. Two developments really helped in Paris a lot: the creation of the High Ambition Group to step forward and pressure other nations, and also the savvy diplomatic efforts of the low island states and LDCs to also put pressure on. And we need this to come from multiple sources, multiple new high ambition coalitions in mitigation, adaptation, sustainable development, agriculture, forestry, negative emissions across the piece. And then these coalitions can create this positive ratchet, this dynamic of increasing ambition and action leading to success. And the significance of the 1.5 degree target is it touches all three of those levers. It feeds the domestic political narratives, it creates a critical benchmark in evaluating NDCs and the global stock-taking process, and it creates a focal point for high ambition coalitions. So just to wrap up, I know I'm getting the hook here. Paris was a hard-fought compromise, and the details of the text matter, but the big breakthrough was this architecture that works with international politics rather than against it, and if we harness it properly, we can make it work. Thank you.
Two excellent talks. After negotiation with Miles, we've got two questions. We'll have one over there in the middle to start with. Yes, please.
I'll try to be brief, or at least be quick. First, I just have to take issue with your question, why was Kyoto ineffective? I just have to beg to differ here. We had countries with binding targets that actually achieved their targets. We had quantified targets, which are absolutely key in driving domestic policies and measures. We had money moving to developing countries for emission reduction projects. We put a price on carbon. We have the EU ETS. We have domestic trading systems that are now using units that were established at the international level for their domestic trading systems. We have a compliance system that's been a very useful model. It's been lauded among international environmental law treaties, and it served to improve parties' inventories unquestionably. We have international targets that have actually enabled national ambition, which again was helpful in the EU and elsewhere, which is why so very many vulnerable countries have actually supported the Kyoto framework and continue to think it made and makes a lot of sense. And we continue to think that a lot of the elements are useful into the future. Accountability systems, Kyoto had them. Reporting review systems are now a model for what we develop under the Paris Agreement. So I think there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to learn, and we learn very good lessons. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the point is I totally disagree with you.
I think that one will run for several hours or weeks.
I'll give a very small response.
Give it a short one. Yeah, sorry, let's just go down here.
Well, I can't resist associating my remarks with the delegate from St. Lucia. MJ, but I can entirely agree, and I think it's time the EU ratifies the second commitment period, but that's not my question. My question is to Professor Rajamani. I think we've heard a lot about the link between the global temperature goal, well below 2, and 1.5, and the long-term goal on mitigation, but there is also a global goal on adaptation in Article 7.1, and it refers to ensuring an adequate adaptation response in the context of the temperature goal. And if you could just say more about how that could be operationalized, how much legal force that has.
Both of those, please.
Sure, and we could have a whole session picking over the bones of Kyoto, but I'll just respond very briefly. I think, in my view, Kyoto failed on the only test that mattered: did it bend the emissions curve or not? And it also failed to lead to a ratcheting up of ambition and action. So, my recommendation would be we shouldn't spend too much time picking over those bones. Instead, we should focus on making Paris work and take this architecture and make it as effective as possible.
Thank you, Professor Winkler, for that question. I think the legal character of Article 7.1, the global adaptation goal, is of course peculiar. It doesn't actually create any obligations on parties. It's not framed in that way. And as you know, when we deferred on this, there are many provisions in the adaptation section that actually don't create legally binding obligations or any sort of obligations for parties. However, having said that, the recognition of that link between an adaptation response and the temperature goal, and the link with then 4.1 and Article 2.1a is critical in the context of the Paris Agreement, because it renders the obligations in relation to adaptation dynamic. It means that whatever obligations there are in relation to dynamic, and however you construct the legal character of those obligations are dynamic. As the temperature goal is achieved or not achieved, depending on what trajectories we're on, the adaptation responses change and the adaptation sort of support needed changes. So we need to keep that in mind, and I think that's very critical, and it plays a critical function even though it's not a legally binding goal in that sense.
Okay, I think there we can leave it. Can we thank all of our speakers from this morning?